Well, hello, New Life Church. Glad to be with you again this week. Last week, my wife and I had a bit of a vacation, and it was really, really good to get back home this past Tuesday evening. Since Easter time, we've been looking at this series of messages that I've simply entitled How to Make Better Decisions. And perhaps to excess, I have shared that when we face decisions, we consciously or subconsciously, we all have like a question grid that helps determine what choice we make. And included in that question grid are good questions and probably bad questions, all right? For example, can I afford the payments? That might be an okay question related to buying a home, but if we are asking that question regularly about things like buying a new boat or new television or even a cell phone, not a particularly helpful question. What is the healthier option to eat? Great question to ask. Will anybody find out? Really, really bad question to ask. I think you understand my point here, okay? When faced with various decisions in my past, and I'd like to hope that it's quite a ways back in my past, I was prone to ask questions along these lines. Well, what is the line between moral and immoral? What's the line between ethical and unethical? A question I didn't always answer wisely, as you might remember from an earlier message. What is the line between legal and illegal, between right and wrong? How close can I get to sin without actually sinning? If it's not forbidden in the Bible, how can it be sin? These questions serve nobody well. The intent of these questions is along the lines of, what can I get away with? It reminds me of the first time that I saw our son, Andrew, play soccer in college. I was surprised at how physical and aggressive he was. So we talked afterwards, and he explained, he said, "Dad, we figure out very early in a soccer match what the refs are going to allow, how closely they're going to they're going to call plays that are borderline questionable. And then we adjust accordingly. The rules are whatever the ref determines the rules are for that particular match. So we play aggressively as we can and still get away with it." Now, that's not bad counsel and advice for a soccer team when you're playing college sports and your coach tells you to do that. But more important domains of life require better guidelines. So far, I've shared with you 3 questions that I'd encourage you to add to your question grid when you're making significant decisions. The first question has been called the integrity question, and that is simply this: am I being honest with myself? Really? The second question has been called the legacy question. What story do I want to tell? You want to know something? That question has become much more looming in front of me the older I get. 2 weeks ago, the question that we looked at has been called the conscience question. And that is simply this: is there a tension and uncertainty? Is there a tension that demands my attention? All right? I discovered the question that we're going to be looking at today probably about 15 years ago, and I have shared it with other people many, many times. We're going to get to it shortly and all, but trust me, there's a good question coming, okay? Now, if you've been any kind of a student of human behavior during your lifetime, you've noticed that it's almost part of every person's human nature to get right up to the edge of irresponsibility, to get right up to the edge of disaster sometimes, to get it right up to the edge of embarrassment, and then stay there as long as we possibly can. Unfortunately, we oftentimes pay a price for that approach, and it's far worse than simply having a whistle blown at us during a soccer match. You see, no responsible parent would ever use similar guidelines for their 3-year-old, for example, because the danger isn't just where you are at. The danger lies in where you're headed, which makes this next question be so important. We have a fireplace in our living room at our house. We light a fire most evenings when we're home during the wintertime. When our grandsons are visiting, and for those who don't know, they're all 3 years old and younger, we generally don't start fires, all right? So it's never hot when they are there over by the fireplace. But our kids and us, we don't allow the boys to toddle over there anyways. When they get to the point where they're about maybe 2 feet away from it, that's when the warning starts. And it's not because of where they are at. 2 feet away from the fireplace is actually a place of safety. It's not about where they're at, it's about where they could be headed. We don't want them to have a false sense that a fireplace can be a fun place ever. And knowing that a 3-year-old isn't always going to be steady on his feet, and all it takes is a bump from another 3-year-old or 1-year-old to knock the child over, potentially knocking them right by or toward the fireplace where they might put a hand on the hot glass or the hot metal frame, that's dangerous. A 3-year-old that close or 1-year-old that close to a fireplace leaves very little margin for error. Proverbs 7 tells about a simple-minded young man, certainly at least a teenager, who gets seduced by a prostitute. And we read this starting in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 21. With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her small talk. All at once, notice this, he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. Well, while he is just merely following her, he hasn't committed any physical sexual sin yet. Perhaps in his mind, he's already well past the point of lustful sin. Okay, but would any of us say that even though he hasn't committed a sexual sin, that his path is a good path to be on? Of course not. You see, an option can be both not wrong and unwise at the same time. And following a prostitute might not be considered wrong per se, but certainly not wise. So asking the question, is it wrong, will often not serve us well. There is a better way, which is why Paul wrote to the Corinthian church on 2 different occasions in the first letter that he wrote to them. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23, he says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Earlier on in chapter 6, verse 12, he says, everything is permissible, but I will not be mastered. I will not be controlled by anything. Here's what Paul is saying. Permissible doesn't mean wise. Permissible doesn't mean best. Setting the boundary lines according to what is legal versus illegal, moral versus sinful, it leaves us no margin for error, and in matters of significant importance, that can lead to disastrous consequences. So our fourth question that we're looking at today, this week, is called the maturity question, and it's simply this. What is the wise thing to do? This question actually is like the first week's question, can be asked a little bit more thoroughly. Let me put it in these terms. In light of my past consequences, my current circumstances, and my future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing for me to do? We're going to look at all three of those in our time remaining today, okay? So first, the wise thing for me to do will always include reflection on my past experiences. When Paul says back in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, everything is permissible, but I will not be mastered or controlled by anything, I get the sense that he recognizes that in an earlier time in his life, he had been mastered, he had been controlled by something, and he was wanting to preserve his freedom as much as he possibly could at this stage of his life following Jesus Christ wholeheartedly. Perhaps at one point he had asked, how could I have been so misled by my religious leaders that I actually justified killing innocent people? You see, Paul had come to understand that strict adherence to even well-meaning teaching had the potential to lead him to hate some of his own people. And he did hate Jewish people who were followers of Jesus Christ. He hunted them down in order to persecute them and hopefully to execute them. He was mastered. He was controlled by his Jewish Pharisee world. And he knew that he needed to choose, eventually knew that he needed to choose a different path. He learned from his past experience and gained a principle that served him well throughout the remainder of his life. It's been said this, and this is a bit of a change from a quote that you might be familiar with, okay? Those who don't pay attention to what got them into trouble yesterday are liable to end up in the same trouble tomorrow. So I gave some thought to that. And I've shared before that over the years I have learned that I've got some addictive tendencies. Born and raised in a solid, scripturally based, spiritual, Christ-loving home. Me, and I think even both of my two older brothers would say, yeah, we've got some tendencies toward addictions. And I think a couple generations up, there was actually some alcoholic challenges that one of my grandparents dealt with and all. But deep down, I think probably most of us have some type of addictive tendency. For me, challenging mental puzzles on my phone have in the past been an addiction. So I strictly limit myself to one word puzzle each day. It's the one online called Wordle. I haven't downloaded the app. I refuse to let the app get on my phone. All right, I play it while I'm online. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes, and that's all the time that I can afford. I love what the New York Times has done with that particular game. They have said we're only going to allow one of these games per day and not two, because if there was two, then why not 4 and why not 10? And that's when Larry Burg would get addicted to it as well. So one game, 5 to 10 minutes a day. I don't even play it every single day. You see, if I ignore my past experiences when I could download a game on my phone and play it sometimes for 2 hours without even looking up, those past addictive tendencies can control me, and I'll much more easily wander into repeat addiction again. All right? I despise that tendency in my heart and in my mind passionately. And I ruthlessly need to eliminate it from my life. Here's my guess. My guess is that you might have an addictive tendency, that you are able to look at past experience and you want to know something. You determined at some point in time, I really shouldn't be spending so much time doing that. I really shouldn't be controlled so much by that and all. But then you've wandered back into it again instead of ruthlessly eliminating it from your life. All right? If you want an example from the Bible of someone whose past experiences didn't prevent him from foolish decisions, all you have to do is look at the wisest person in the Bible, King Solomon. And I say wisest with quotation marks because there was a lot of non-wisdom that man ended up living and living out, okay? You see, he watched his father during his childhood. He watched his father, King David, create an absolute mess of their family structure, all right? They had incredible family dysfunction, and it was largely due to David's decision to have more than one wife and to have multiple children with more than one wife. Solomon saw incest, rape, murder, actually, all of those coming from David's poor decision. And while Solomon's writings in Proverbs and in the book of Ecclesiastes are amazing in their breadth of insight and in their depth of observation and wisdom gained from experience, he was an absolute failure by letting the painful experiences of his childhood not keep him from guiding his decisions. 700 wives is what he's recorded as having, 300 other women who were his sexual partners, and those women led him to worship an idol that required child sacrifice. David, in spite of all his faults, is called a man after God's own heart, but trust me, by the end of his life, Solomon had had wandered far, had allowed his heart to wander far away from God because he didn't look at his past experiences as a child, watching his dad make numerous mistakes, learn from those, and apply the wisdom from those experiences to decisions that he had to make. Here's the lesson that I see in Solomon, okay? Something within all of us can be so powerful that even those who possess the greatest amount of wisdom are still capable of ignoring it. I propose this. True wisdom requires the practical application of knowledge, observation, and experience. So I ask you, what lessons have you learned from the pain of your past experiences and mistakes? Second, not just past experiences are important, but also current circumstances. So the wise thing for me to do will always include reflection on my current circumstances. Here's what comes to mind, okay? Sometimes your current circumstances will necessitate that you refuse to take a path that at other times could serve you very well. Because the circumstances in our lives change. Sometimes they change 180 degrees. Think about, I've been reading through the book, the Gospel of John recently, and here's what I've noticed in both John 2 and in John 7. Not with strangers, with his very own family. Jesus has to tell first his mother in John chapter 2, and then his brothers in John chapter 7, my time has not yet come. What's he referring to in those verses? On both occasions, he was communicating that the time to reveal the greatest truth about himself, okay, that he was the promised Messiah, that time had not come. Even that great truth shouldn't be communicated or acted on at the wrong time. We have a close friend who unexpectedly just lost his job. 2 months ago, buying a new car for him would have been a completely understandable decision. Easy to defend. It probably wouldn't be wise for him now to even buy a bicycle until his uncertain finances can become more stable. Circumstances need to be paid attention to. And here's why. Even when faced with decisions of only marginal or moderate importance, we are always wise to take our current emotions, our state of mind, our perspective, our finances, our health, our relationships, to take those into consideration before we pursue a path of action. Listen to this. When finances are tight, the smartest thing to buy is nothing. When I'm discouraged, the best thing for me to do is nothing. When I'm mad, the wisest thing for me to say is nothing. When a person finds themselves recently widowed or divorced, the safest person for them to date is no one. And when the world's messages are distorted, the best thing for me to believe is the Bible. Did you think I was going to say the best thing for me to believe is nothing? No, of course not. All right? So, we have to look at our current circumstances and say, based on these current circumstances, what is the wise thing for me to do? Caution. Take caution. Rather than plunging headlong in a particular course of action. So pay attention to our past experiences, pay attention to our current circumstances, and finally, the wise thing for me to do will always include reflection on future hopes and dreams. We rob ourselves when we make decisions in the moment with no thought of how these decisions will impact our future. For this message, it's Mother's Day weekend coming up. For this message, I thought, it'd really be nice to tie in these messages with a passage like Proverbs 31 that focuses on the wife of noble character. And so I studied that passage, looked at it and all, and I just couldn't find examples that fit each of these 3 points that I'm making today, all right? Except for this last one, okay? And even then, it's only a reasonable fit. It's not a perfect fit, okay? But in describing a noble wife, the author writes this, Proverbs 31, verse 16. Talking about her says, she considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, She plants a vineyard. She doesn't plant a cash crop. She doesn't plant wheat that is going to become something she can harvest in a few months. She plants a vineyard. So I did a Google search this week. And most new vineyards take at least 3 years to produce any grapes. All right? This noble woman, this noble wife, makes the decision to take from her hard-earned savings and invest it in a dream that won't benefit her for over 3 years. Life is hard, my friends. So invest in your hopes and dreams for the future. But knowing that life is hard, why would anyone contribute to the demise of their hopes and dreams or rob themselves of their own future? You've watched that happen in others' lives, and at times you've probably shaken your head and said, what in the world were they thinking? I'll tell you what they weren't thinking. They weren't thinking of what's going to happen to my hopes and dreams for the future. A friend of mine from college days refused to filter her abrasive and caustic words and lost a long-term job opportunity that is going to have devastating ramifications for her retirement. You could probably think of someone who has done something similar. You've probably known someone whose arrogance has destroyed a friendship and closed off doors of opportunity. You might know someone whose addiction to pornography has destroyed hopes for a lifelong loving marriage. You've watched someone's life implode from abusing alcohol. Now, in some of these cases that I've cited, what those people have done might not be anything illegal, might not even be anything immoral. But this question, what is the wise thing to do? That's not to stop you from doing something wrong. It's to keep you from doing something unwise. Last Saturday, I had the opportunity to do something I've been hoping to do for quite a long time. I've got a brother-in-law who's an accountant who works for the Berkshire Hathaway company. It's been led by Warren Buffett for probably 60 plus odd years, based in Omaha, Nebraska. And once a year they have their annual meeting, and Warren Buffett, who is now in his early 90s, sits at a table at this annual meeting. It's held in a huge arena, 20,000 people there and all. And questions are tossed to him that he hasn't reviewed beforehand. He doesn't know what's coming. And then he gives answers to those questions. Oftentimes, people are looking for advice related to both finances as well as other aspects of life, looking for insights on the economy. And my brother-in-law has invited me for probably 10 years now, if I'm ever in Omaha, Nebraska, to go to something like that on the first Saturday in May. And last week it worked out. It was really quite interesting. So Warren Buffett, for those who don't know, I think at this point in time, he's the 9th richest man or person in the world. In 2008, he was the world's richest man. He didn't invent anything that I know of except for just an amazing investment strategy. All of his wealth has come from really wise investments for the last, actually going back to the 1940s, okay? So almost 80 years, okay? Here's what I found out. I found out that he and his associates, his main assistants, one of their guiding principles for their investments over the years has simply been this, that they wanted to be consistently not stupid. He says that, all right? That's a genius principle. I love that. Just to avoid being consistently not stupid. It's the flip side of saying, let's be consistently wise. But he knows that some of the investment decisions that he's made over the years haven't always been the best ones. Sometimes they win, sometimes they fail. Making major decisions without considering the future consequences is often incredibly stupid. Why would we do that? Why would we do it again when past experience has shown that it has blown up in our face before? And that's why wise people, we say no to some good things early on in order to enjoy the best things later on. Parents, that means that the wise decisions to make with your children will often not be popular with them. Make wise decisions anyways. You're the grown-up. You're the adult. I believe that this thing of what is the wise thing to do. It's an essential question to ask in the pursuit of decisions that align with our pursuit of our church's mission, and that is to help each person take their next step of faith in Christ. Because wise decisions oftentimes don't produce great short-term consequences. Wise decisions often mean that we might have to delay gratification for some time down the road. And when we do that, we are, by faith, believing that God will fulfill his promises to us in the future, even if they don't seem like they're being fulfilled to us in the present. And parents, what a great question to teach your children. Sit with them and ask them, what's the wise thing to do? You can start doing that when they're 5 years old or 7 years old. Why would you not do that? Help them connect the dots. If we do this, what's going to result from this? And help them to see where it leads. I didn't discover this question. Did I try to make wise decisions in my life? Absolutely. But I didn't discover this question as being one of the linchpin questions for decisions that I make. And I didn't even considered it until I was in my 40s. But it has often guided me over the past about 15 years, and it will give direction for my decisions until the day I die. Friends, don't merely settle for good or legal or permissible or acceptable or tolerable or not prosecutable or normal. You deserve better than that. Your family deserves better than that. So commit yourself to the pursuit of wise decisions. I promise you, with all of my heart, I promise you, it will serve you well. It has been serving me well for 15 years now. Hey, if I could give you a little bit of homework before I wrap this up in prayer. If you've never done this, I would encourage you, why not take the next month and read through the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. Okay, there's 31 chapters. Essentially, you can read one chapter a day. Probably going to take you about maybe 10 minutes a day. If you want to take the time to reflect on it more, maybe 20 minutes a day. Okay? And as you read, look for examples of how wisdom takes into account past experiences, current circumstances, and future hopes and dreams. I think you'll find lots of examples where what Proverbs teaches, Solomon is the primary author of it, aligns with this great question for us. What is the wise thing to do? Hey, let's pray. God, I'm fully aware that there's some who are watching this video that they aren't faced with a big decision right now. They might not be faced with a major decision at any time over the next 2-3 months, maybe longer than that. But probably there are some who have big decisions that are looming. Financial decisions, relationship decisions, parenting decisions, maybe career decisions. And so often, God, we have not learned from our past experiences. We have ignored our current circumstances. We have not pulled back from the decision and looked ahead as far as how is this going to affect my future hopes, my dreams for the next 20, 30 years. And we have consistently or often ended up making decisions, God, that have led to so many regrets. May we be wise. May each person watching this, God, I pray that they would remember this. I remember the first time seeing this question saying, well, of course, this needs to be one of the premier decisions I use in day-by-day living. Let that be the case for each person watching today. I believe if we make wiser decisions, our lives will result in greater long-term blessing, and I know that you will be more greatly honored and your love reflected far more clearly in our lives than if we ignore this wonderful question. In Christ's name, I ask these things. Amen. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.